So what does pornography do? Well, first of all, it's a surfeit of hedonistic pleasure. It's whim-based. It doesn't constitute the kind of action that lays the groundwork for functional relationships. It stops you from being desperate enough to go and put yourself on the line in a real relationship. It trains you sexually to respond only to pornography. It requires that you use more and more novel forms of pornography as your habit develops in order to get the same kick. It increases the probability of impotence in real life. There's nothing about it that's good. And then the fact of its wide distribution online, let's say, also entices girls into the kind of quasi-prostitution that characterizes, OnlyFans and sites like that. No, this isn't a good thing. It's not a good thing. It's like it tilts people hard towards a short-term mating outlook, and that's a bad idea. It's not a good idea to employ sexuality in the services of short-term gratification, because short-term gratification is a bad strategy. Why? Because short-term gratification doesn't iterate well. And you know this. This is why it's not that good an idea to overuse cocaine. It's like, well, it's a great drug. Activates the system that is at the base of positive emotion itself. Why not use it? Because people, psychologists, researchers think, well, why do people use drugs? That's a stupid question. We absolutely know why people use drugs. What we don't know is why everyone doesn't use them all the time. And here's how we know this, for example. There are three broad categories of drugs of abuse. There's the anti-anxiety drugs, alcohol, barbiturates, and benzodiazepines. And there's the psychomotor stimulants, and that's cocaine and amphetamines, essentially, methamphetamine as well. And there's the opiates, which are analgesic. Now, what does cocaine do? Well, you have a biological system within you that is activated when you're moving towards valuable goals. And the subjective experience of activation of that system is positive emotion. It's enthusiasm. It's engagement. It's the sense that you're doing something vital and meaningful. Cocaine and drugs like it activate that system. So it's no mystery at all why people will use cocaine. Well, so what happens if you use it all the time? The answer is you go downhill very, very rapidly. Short-term impulsive hedonic gratification is not a strategy that iterates well across time. And short-term sexual gratification strategies have exactly the same problem. This is happening more and more commonly, by the way. As women free themselves from the shackles of monogamous relationships and are more likely to engage in short-term mating strategies, you might think that's a very good thing for men. But turns out it's not such a good thing for men because women are quite picky. And so women rate 80% of men online as below average in attractiveness. And whereas men rate 50% of women as below average attractiveness, which by the way is true, but it's 80% of men. And so what that means is that the attention of women in an open mating market is focused on a very small percentage of men. And what's happening in colleges and universities where women dominate in terms of proportion of population is that all the women are chasing a very small number of men. So most of the men have no partners at all, and some of the men have more partners than they know what to do with. And so those men pursue short-term mating strategies, which is not so good for the women because they just as soon have an actual relationship. But then you might ask, well, what does it do to the men? And that's easy, is that it trains them to adopt antisocial short-term mating strategies. And that's really bad practice, because if you practice exploiting people for your momentary gratification, then you'll become an expert at that. That's an antisocial / psychopathic mode of interaction. And you might say, so what? Look at all the sex. And the answer is, well, that's just not going to work out very well for you as you try to build yourself something approximating a stable and fulfilling life. Because you are not going to be able to do that if you treat other people as if they're the device for your momentary gratification. No one who's sophisticated in any real sense is going to put up with that. And so it might work well in the short term, but it's a absolutely cataclysmically dreadful medium to long-term strategy. We know this too because psychopaths use strategy like that because they're predatory parasites. And to be a successful psychopath, unless you operate online, which is where most psychopaths operate now, you have to keep moving. You might say, well, everyone successful is a psychopath. It's like, no, that's actually wrong. Psychopaths are rarely successful. they're somewhat more successful than people who don't do anything. But in order to maintain any success at all, they have to be itinerant. Because if you're a predatory parasite and you manipulate other people, they figure it out and then they remember who you are. And people are very good at remembering those things. And then your reputation is damaged as a consequence of the truth. And then in order to continue operating successfully as a psychopath, you have to go somewhere else. So back to pornography.
You know, if you're masturbating to pornography and the consequence of that is an immediate influx of guilt, then you have to ask yourself who's in control. And that's a really important question, who's in control. That's what terrified me about developing some psychoanalytic acumen, because once you realize that you're a house that many spirits can and do inhabit, and that many of them aren't you, and that many of them aren't working towards the purposes you might want yourself to be working to. And that's the realization of the myth that you're embodying from the Jungian perspective. It's a very, very serious question. The fundamental human myth is Cain versus Abel. And so who are you? Are you Cain or Abel? Well, the answer is you're both. And then the question is, well, who's got the upper hand? And then the next question is, who do you want to have the upper hand? Is it God and Abel or Satan and Cain? And that's a question that's just as germane to non-believers as it is to believers. And isn't that remarkable and appalling and overwhelming and terrifying all at the same time, if you have any sense of what it means? So if your behavior is embarrassing you, well, there's only two possibilities, isn't there? You shouldn't be so embarrassed. And I suppose the voice that says yes to all expression of human sexuality would say that your guilt and shame is merely the detrimental hangover of an oppressive patriarchy that's judgmental in its attitudes towards sexuality. Well, yeah, well, what would you use judgment to differentiate if it isn't sexuality? So I don't think that argument goes anywhere. You have to consult your own conscience. Like, I know the conscience can become an oppressive force on its own. That's the indwelling of the great tyrant, you know, and Freud made much of that, a too oppressive superego. And I've certainly seen clients whose expression of healthy sexuality was inhibited by a too rigid superego. That can definitely happen. Sexual shame is there for a reason, and it's not a trivial reason. And it's not just going to go away because we may wave the magic wand and make the patriarchal oppressor vanish. And that's not going to happen either, by the way. If you're ashamed about your sexual behavior, then you have to ask yourself, is the shame wrong or is the sexual behavior wrong? And I'm asking you, I'm not judging your behavior, because what the hell do I know about you? And I have enough trouble with my own behavior. So, you know, this is on you. Is your shame what you should be dispensing with, or the behavior? And, you know, it might be a little of column A and a little of column B, because life is never simple. If you don't feel ennobled by your porn-related masturbation, then perhaps that means it's of questionable utility. I certainly don't see it as a stabilizing social force. I don't see it as something people do in public and brag about. And I know that sexual behavior is private and should remain that way, but you get what I'm driving at. Look, I think people shouldn't lie, especially to themselves. And I think repeatedly engaging in a behavior that you judge yourself to be morally reprehensible is a form of performative contradiction, which is the acting out of a lie. And I suspect you know that, or you wouldn't be asking the question. And so, you know, what should you do with pornography? Well, you know the answer to that, and so does everybody else. Everyone knows it's not good. It's not good for those who produce it. It's not good for those who participate, wittingly or unwittingly, because there's plenty of them, in its production. It's not good for its consumers, or certainly not the highest good. And what's the highest good? Sexuality incorporated within a functional, intimate relationship, bound by vows of mutual celibacy. And we all know that too. That stabilizes our families. It stabilizes our societies. It stabilizes our psyches. And so anything you do that isn't in service of that goal is likely to be counterproductive. And I suspect it's your own psyche, your own soul telling you that. So if your sexual behavior isn't an expression of your highest being, it isn't serving you in the deepest sense. You're serving it. And that's what your shame indicates.
Ready to conquer NoFap? Grab our digital NoFap guide now. End your porn addiction. Skyrocket your self-esteem and achieve your goals. Packed with proven techniques, expert advice, and relapse prevention tricks. Click the link below and break free today.